Before we dig in, the couple of housekeeping things. If you may have missed, I don't see any ashes, so I'm guessing that y'all missed them this morning. So if you want the extra credit opportunity for the Ash Wednesday services here, there is one more Ash Wednesday service today on campus. It'll be at 5 o'clock in here. So be back in here at 5 o'clock and send me a picture of yourself with ashes on your forehead, or then I'll know and give you credit, some extra credit for you. Huh? Sure. If you come at 5 o'clock today and come to service, sure. Or you can send it to me through Google Classroom or email. Either way, whatever.
What time does it end?
It takes about 45 minutes, I think. So I don't know. I wasn't here for either of the two earlier services, so I can't say exactly how long it lasts. But some of it depends on how many people are here, because ministers will put ashes on the forehead of each person, and so if you got 50 people here, it takes longer than if you got 15. But I'd say probably about 40 to 45 minutes. And then second housekeeping item, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, in case anybody wasn't in the room yet, our next exam, the second exam, will be 2 weeks from today, which will be the Wednesday following spring break. And you should have a study guide posted sometime in the next few days, middle of next week at the latest, depending on how my schedule goes. But you should have a study guide out in plenty of time to be able to look it over and get ready for the exam, which is 2 weeks from today. As far as I know, that's it for housekeeping stuff. Today we're picking up with 1 Samuel. We got through, last time we talked about the end of the period of the Judges and the escalating corruption in Israel, how bad things had gotten. So that was the last several stories in Judges was for the purpose of causing us to see how bad things in Israel had gotten. And then 1 Samuel begins with the birth of Samuel and then his call to be the last judge of Israel, the last one to rule over Israel as a judge, and the first of the prophets that hear the word of the Lord and confront kings and other leaders when they're going off the rails. And so Samuel is this transition. He's the figure that is a transition between the period of the Judges when judges ruled Israel as much as there was any kind of central leader, to the period of the United Monarchy where Israel has a king and prophets frequently speak on God's behalf to the king and confront them when they're doing something wrong. And the end of the story, where we got to last time, we saw the people of Israel, or some of the leaders of Israel, trying to carry the Ark of the Covenant as a good luck charm in front of them to battle, and the two sons of Eli, the priest, being killed, and then Eli himself falling out of his chair and dying of a broken neck when he hears that the Ark of the Covenant has been taken by the Philistines. And then we saw the Philistines and their experience with the ark and all the things that went terribly wrong for them, and basically God defeating the Philistines without Israelite help and bringing the Ark of the Covenant back to the Israelites, along with spoils of battle, as they send back golden tumors and golden rats. And so that's kind of where we ended the story last time, was with the Ark of the Covenant coming back to Israel and God demonstrating his power over even the Philistines, even without the Israelites. And the next kind of chunk of the story, the next thing that happens is some of the Israelites, or many of the Israelites, get together, many people of Israel get together and go to Samuel and ask him to anoint them a king, anoint someone to rule over them as king. And the reason, or the thing that they want, the reason that they're asking, is because they see that all the nations around them have kings, and that the nations around them are doing well, and they think that if they can have a king, they'll become prosperous like that and things will go well for them. And so they go and they say, make for us a king, or anoint for us a king, so that we can be like all the other nations. Well, the whole point of Israel is to not be like all the other nations. They're supposed to be different from all the other nations as they obey God's law and demonstrate the goodness of God, God's wisdom, and the wisdom of the law that God has given them, so that all the nations will look to them and want to know this God. But instead, they want a king so that they can be like all the other nations around them. And Samuel at first is extremely against this idea, very, very angry that they have suggested it, and kind of starts to warn him and tell him off. but he does what he ought to do as a judge and as soon to be prophet, and he goes and asks God what to do now that the Israelites have made this request that they want a king. And God tells Samuel basically that, yeah, their motives are all wrong, they're asking for all the wrong reasons, but give them a king. Go ahead and give them what they ask for. But warn them of what's going to happen as a result. Warn them that the king is going to take advantage of them and demand their sons and their daughters for warriors and for servants, and that they will have to give so much of their money and their resources to them every year, and they'll amass up this great wealth for themselves, and eventually they'll probably end up abusing the people. Just warn them what's coming. And so Samuel goes and tells them what God told him to say, warns them what's coming, but the people still want a king, and so Samuel says, I will anoint you a king. Go and God will show me the one that he has chosen to be your king, and I'll anoint him. Well, shortly thereafter, a guy named Saul is chasing down his father's lost donkey, and decides that they can't find him. Him and a servant is trying to find this donkey, and they can't find it. They don't know what to do to get it. And so the servant says, well, there's this seer, this guy that gets messages from God named Samuel. I think we've got enough stuff amongst us between the two of us to go and make an offering. And so if we go and make an offering, Samuel maybe he can tell us, the seer can tell us where the donkey is gone. And so they go to come to Samuel, and they amass together what they've got amongst them to get Samuel's attention and to make an offering and have Samuel tell them where the donkey's gone. But when they get there, Samuel has prepared a feast for Saul. Samuel knew Saul was coming and has prepared a feast for him, and they have this feast, they have this meal, and the best portion is set aside for Saul. Saul is there, he's kind of not sure what's going on. But when the meal is over and Samuel sends everyone else away and hangs Saul back for a second and tells him, you don't have to worry about your father's donkey. It's already made its way back home, but you are the one that God has chosen to be king over Israel. And so Saul takes a horn full of oil and pours it over his head, anoints him with oil, and anoints him to be the king of Israel. And at first, not much happens there. The Saul has been anointed to be king, but the people don't recognize him as king. They haven't made him king yet. And he starts to be recognized as king. Samuel presents him as the one who has been anointed to be king in a kind of weird moment where Saul is actually hiding behind some boxes amongst the provisions instead of being out front with the rest when Samuel's trying to present him as the anointed king. But they bring him out, and he's presented to the people as the anointed king. But he's not widely accepted for a while. And then there is a city, a particular town of the Israelites, that the Philistines come up to attack, and they've encamped around it, and the Philistines make these really obnoxious demands, and the people of the city send out messengers asking for help. And Saul hears about what's happening, and he immediately goes and rallies a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of fighting men to come from Israel, and rallies a whole bunch of fighting men from Israel to come and defend this city. And he defeats the big Philistine army that was there to attack this city and protects this town. And the people rally around him and recognize him as king because of his willingness to come and defend this city. They acknowledge him as king. And so he becomes king and is recognized as king, but they're still relatively weak compared to the Philistines. In fact, there's a scene at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 13 where we're told that the Israelites didn't have any kind of iron weapons. We've gotten into the Iron Age, and so the iron has replaced bronze as the ideal weapon material of choice. It's a better metal, it's a stronger, harder metal that makes better weapons and better tools. But the Philistines have so oppressed and manipulated things within Israel that they've been able to have so much influence over Israel that they've managed to keep Israel from having blacksmiths. And so they don't have smiths that can work on iron weapons and tools. And there aren't really any iron weapons in Israel. In fact, only Saul, the king, and his son have an iron weapons of any kind. They each have a sword. But everybody else is fighting with bronze weapons or with their iron farming tools. And the people actually have to go down to the Philistines. The Israelites have to go down to the Philistines and pay Philistines to sharpen their iron tools, their farming implements. And so they don't really have this they're at a major technological disadvantage, but against the Philistines. The Philistines have iron weaponry and have been using it, and the Israelites have been kept from getting iron weaponry by the Philistines. And so they're at this kind of disadvantage. But even so, they end up having to fight against, and they win against this Philistine army. I'm jumping ahead of myself. Back up a second. They're encamped against it. That there's this battle upcoming between the Philistines and the Israelites, and Saul is very nervous about the outcome, about the way this is going to go. And so Samuel is supposed to come and offer a sacrifice before the battle, and people, bless the warriors of Israel before they go into battle against the Philistines. And there's a particular day that Samuel is supposed to come, and it's 7 days out from when Saul starts to gather his army together. And so he's gathered his army together, and they're waiting on Samuel to get there. And as they keep waiting, Saul is more and more afraid that the army that he has gathered, the people of Israel that he's gathered to fight, are going to start getting scared, or they're going to lose their courage, and bands are just going to start wandering away, defect from the army. They're just going to wander away, and he's going to be left with no army left. And on day 7, the day that Samuel is supposed to come and offer the sacrifice, Saul's fear of this outcome has reached the fever pitch. It's reached this high point. And so before Samuel arrives, Saul convinces himself that Samuel is not coming. Something's happened. He's not going to come. And so Saul goes and makes the sacrifice himself. He goes and prepares and offers the sacrifice on the altar himself rather than waiting on Samuel. Now, this is not okay. Saul offering this sacrifice is not okay, because it is unifying the role of the priest and the king. And these roles are supposed to be very, very different. The king is never supposed to take on the priestly roles and do the job of the priest. Because there are lots of countries, there were lots of nations in the world at the time that had priest kings, that had unified, had the king was also the high priest of their religion. And in almost every case where there was a king priest or a priest king, where the priesthood and the kingship were united, the king ended up being worshipped as God. Over time, the king ended up becoming a divine figure, and people made sacrifices to that king as a divine figure, as a god. And so if the two roles were united, there was this big tendency to go into worshiping the king, because he was then the major political leader and the major religious leader, and that just kind of became a natural thing to do, to worship the king as God, or at least being as a representative of God. And so God had made it really clear that this was never to happen. The priests all had to be from the family of Aaron, and the kings he was not a Levite, he was a Benjamite. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. He could not be priest. And yet, in his fear that day, he prepares and offers a sacrifice. And of course, about 5 minutes after he's done offering the sacrifice, Samuel shows up to offer the sacrifice. And so Samuel confronts Saul and tells him that because of what he's done, because he has not obeyed God and not given honor to God by doing what God told him to do, God is going to take the kingdom away from his family, and his son will not inherit the kingdom after him. God will choose someone else to be king, and his family will not remain in control. So Saul will not have a dynasty. His son will not inherit the kingdom. And Saul's not real happy about that, but he moves on. He's still king, and he's going to remain king. He's just been told that he's not allowed, his son will not inherit after him. And his son's name is Jonathan, and as the story progresses, Jonathan and David become very close friends. So when we get there, remember that's fairly significant. But Jonathan, Saul's son, goes with a retainer, with the person that is in charge of keeping up his armor bearer, shield bearer. So Jonathan and this one servant go up to this Philistine city and kind of taunt them into attacking them. And Jonathan and the shield bearer together end up killing about 20 Philistines over a short amount of time and in a small area. And when they come back and report their success and their victory, and the Israelites see it, they are encouraged and really riled up that the son of the king had done this. And so they're ready to go out and fight the Philistines. And so they go out and fight the Philistines, and they end up having a great victory. And after this great victory, God had told Saul to kill the king of the Philistines, to kill off the leader of the Philistines that was leading this group against the Israelites. And instead of killing the king of the Philistines, Saul realizes that if he instead captures him and makes him a vassal to the Israelites. Vassal, by the way, a vassal king was a king of a city or a people that had been subjugated by another people and were forced to live as kind of a lesser kingdom or a lesser state. It's kind of a territory of the kingdom that defeated them. And so Saul realizes that if he makes this king into kind of a vassal king and opens up trade with his city and with his people, that the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, can get wealthy and he can get wealthy in the process. That there'll be a whole lot more money in it, a whole lot more prosperity in it if he spares the life of the king and opens up trade with him instead of killing him. And so he does. He captures the king and he doesn't kill them, and he starts to discuss potential trade and treaty with him. And Samuel comes up and confronts Saul and tells him basically that he has failed again to do what God told him to do. He's failed to keep the commands of the Lord, and he has taken a life for himself that God had demanded. So he's kept for himself something that God demanded that he killed. And so Samuel kills the king, the Philistine king, and then tells Saul that because he has rejected God and rejected God's commands a second time, that not only will his son not inherit the kingdom, but that God has rejected him as king and that he will be replaced soon. This begins a kind of spiral for Saul. When Saul hears and believes that he has been rejected as king and he's not going to be allowed to remain king, that somebody is going to replace him, he starts to get really paranoid about who might be going to replace him. And so he starts lashing out at people, and the text describes as though an evil spirit from the Lord comes over him. And so he starts to have a kind of a psychological break because he has been told that he is not going to be king, that God has rejected him as king and he's going to be replaced. And so he starts to get very paranoid and start to have all these kind of bad moments and bad spells along the way. And he's going to throw spears at people, including his own son at one point, because his son seems to be on David's side, and he's afraid that Jonathan is conspiring against him to have David become king. But after this scene where Saul is rejected as king, and because he failed to kill the Israelite king, God tells Samuel to go and to anoint the next king of Israel, and that he should go to the household of a man named Jesse, and God would show him which of the sons of Jesse is to be the next king. And so he goes to, under the pretense of making an offering with Jesse's family, he goes and he asks Jesse to introduce him to all of his sons, and he waits for the one that God has chosen to come and for God to say, he's the one, that's the one, and anoint him. And so he goes to Jesse's household, and he's there, and they've prepared a kind of a feast to go with the sacrifices to be made. And Jesse starts to introduce his sons to Samuel, and he starts with the oldest. And when the oldest son comes up, Samuel looks at him and says, "Oh, now this guy looks like a king. He's tall, he's strong, he's handsome. He looks like a king. Surely this is the Lord's anointed. This is the one that God has chosen." But God tells Samuel, no, he is not the one. God, you are looking on the outward appearance. Humans look at the outward appearance, but God is looking at the heart. And so this is not the one that the Lord has anointed. Right? This is not the Lord's anointed one. And so that son passes by, and the next one in the birth order passes by, and it's not him either. And one by one, all of the sons pass by, and none of them are chosen. None of them, God doesn't tell Samuel to get up and anoint any of those. And so Samuel was kind of confused at this point. He says, well, God told me to come here, and one of the sons of Jesse would be anointed to be king of Israel, would be the one that God chose. And so he looks at Jesse and he says, are these all your sons? Are there any other sons that aren't here? And Jesse says, well, yeah, there's the youngest who's out in the field with the sheep, he's out in the field with the flocks right now, but he's just the kind of runt, the youngest. And Samuel says, well, go and get him. We won't start the meal until he's here. And so they go and get David, they bring him in, and as soon as Samuel sees David, God tells Samuel to get up and anoint him. He is the one. And so Samuel gets up and pours the horn of oil over David's head and anoints him to be the next king of Israel. But David is a very young man, like preteens age at this point, somewhere 10, 12 years old maybe. And so he's not, he's not a threatening figure, or not obviously supposed to be, the next king. He's been anointed by God to be king, but he's still very young. Well, there's some time passes, and there's another battle brewing between the Israelites and the Philistines. And at this point, we're getting into 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we're about to get into probably one of, if not the best known stories in the Old Testament. And so there's this new conflict or battle brewing between the Israelites and the Philistines, and the Israelites don't really have a chance if they go directly toe-to-toe with the Philistines. The technological and numerical advantage lies with the Philistines. And so strategically, they have no chance of winning a straight-up battle with the Philistines. And so they're doing some kind of guerrilla tactics, basically. We're more hit and run, and they're hiding their forces in caves. And so the Israelite army, there's a large mass of the Philistine army encamped, ready for kind of traditional battle. But then there's the Israelite army there's an encampment, but then there's also a whole bunch of forces that are hiding in caves and in the hills in the area. And so they're not all gathered together in one place and not there for a straight up battle. And the Philistines, instead of trying and rooting out all of the Israelites from all of these various caves and all the places that they're hidden, they keep trying to taunt the Israelites into agreeing to a combat by champions or trial by champions. And this was a relatively common, it wasn't like, most battles or anything were settled this way, but it was common enough that it was recognized. That if two armies or two groups, two nations were about to go into a battle, and it was going to be a large scale battle, and there was a potential for a lot of loss of life and a lot of people to be killed on both sides, they could instead agree to have one or a selection of their best warriors from each side battle it out. And then whoever won that mini battle between the best of the warriors amongst them, that would be the winner of the battle, and the other side would surrender. And the thought was, or the idea was, that if the select chosen best warriors from each side, if the best warriors from one side could defeat the best warriors from the other side, then chances are the winning side of the contest of champions would also win the large scale war. And so they could have just a few from each side fight it out and save a whole bunch of lives, not have a whole bunch of people killed on both sides. And so the Philistines are trying to taunt the Israelites into agreeing to this trial by champion, this kind of mini combat. And the problem is that the Philistine champion is abso-freaking-lutely enormous. I mean, he's huge. His name is Goliath, name you've probably heard. This is David and Goliath's story. And Goliath is at least 9 feet tall, according to, depending on how you translate the description. There's actually some potential translations of his description that make him more like 12 feet tall, but that's stretching it. But the NIV translation is that he is 6 cubits and a span high, which would be translated out to about 9 feet 9 inches. So but whatever his size, he's enormous. The precise size is kind of irrelevant. He's enormous. And he is built and strong. He's wearing very heavy armor, and he is extremely skilled in combat. He's been fighting for most of his life. He is a proven warrior. And so he's huge, he's well armed, and he's really good at fighting. And so the Israelites look at Goliath, and they say, there's nobody over here that can fight that. There's nobody over here that can touch him. And so the Israelites are terrified of Goliath. The Israelite army is terrified of Goliath. And so every day, Goliath will step out front of the Philistine army, and he'll start taunting the Israelites and saying all kinds of things about the Israelites and their God and how cowardly they are. And it's like, if your nation, your God is so great, then come out and face me. It just taunting the Israelites and trying to get somebody to come out and fight him and try to force the Israelites into a trial by champion that will end this combat, in the battle before it starts. And of course, the Israelites aren't biting. They don't want to come and face this guy. And so one day, Jesse sends David, as the youngest of his sons, he sends David to where the Israelite army is encamped to bring some supplies, provisions to his older sons who are in the army. They've been conscripted to fight, and so they're all there encamped and waiting on something to happen, the battle to be joined. And so David is sent by his father Jesse with some provisions to bring to his other sons and to check on them and see how they're doing. And so David comes up to, he's bringing this stuff, and he comes up to the Israelite camp just as Goliath has come out for his daily taunting session. And so he's yelling and shouting and speaking all these curses against the God of Israel and the Israelite army and all the people of Israel, and just saying all this rude stuff about God and God's people. And David, when he hears what Goliath says, he's just incensed. He's ticked off that somebody would come and insult God and God's people that way. And then he's also kind of miffed and ticked at the Israelites because they aren't doing anything about it. So why has nobody gone to fight and shut up this Philistine? Why has nobody gone to fight against him? And the people there kind of explain to David what's going on, the situation, that this guy's come out and they're demanding, or they're asking somebody to come and fight against him. But look at him, he's huge. Nobody wants to go and fight that. And then they also mentioned that the king has promised all of these great rewards, including him and his family will live tax-free. They'll not have to pay any taxes to the king from now on. And there will be a monetary reward and even a chance to marry one of the king's daughters and marry into the king's household for the man that will go and fight Goliath and win. And David hears about all this and says, basically, are there no, is there nobody with a spine in Israel? Is nobody courageous enough to go and do this? He says, I'll go, I'll fight him. And soldiers kind of laugh, but word gets back to the king that this young kid, this very young man or older boy, has come into the camp and said, I'll go fight him, go fight Goliath. And so Saul calls this young man in and starts to talk to him. And David goes and speaks to King Saul and tells him, I've fought against, God has given me the ability to fight against bears and lions when they've come against my flock, and this Philistine's no worse than any of those. If God empowers me to win, if God gives me the victory, I'll win, regardless of how big he is. It's not about how big the Philistine is, it's about how powerful God is. If God gives me the victory, I'll win. And so Saul, hearing David's courage and faith, agrees to let him go and fight, but he doesn't think that David can go as he is. I mean, David has shown up as a shepherd boy carrying provisions for his brothers. He's got maybe a staff to carry as a shepherd, and then he's also brought his sling, which is a hunting weapon used to throw rocks to kill small game mostly. And so that's all he's got. And so Saul tries to outfit David in his own personal armor. The problem is that Saul is a tall, strongly built dude, and David is like an early teenager at this point. And David is a smaller guy anyway. He can't wear Saul's armor. It's way too big on him. And so when Saul gets him dressed out and puts the sword in his hand, David says, I can't move in this. I can't fight in this. There's no way that I can do anything in this. And so he takes off all of the armor and everything, and he goes into battle just as he came, with a sling and maybe a staff. And so he, on the way to where Goliath is waiting, where they've drawn out the battle lines, he stops and picks up a few rocks, a few stones, and puts them in a pouch and keeps those with him. And he goes to where Goliath is and confronts him. And Goliath's reaction to seeing David is, he's a little insulted that they would send a child to fight him, basically. This is chapter 17, starting verse 41. It says, "Meanwhile, the Philistine, with the shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, 'Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?' And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. 'Come here,' he said, 'and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals.' So David says to the Philistine, 'You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands.'" And so after David responds to Goliath, Goliath starts, kind of lumbering, walking, moving towards him, expecting David to be no challenge. This is, a kid with a few rocks in a bag. And so he's going to go and just kill him, and he's not in a hurry about it. So he goes walking towards Goliath, and David starts sprinting towards Goliath. And so Goliath is walking towards David, expecting this to be a quick battle. And David, instead of backing away or trying to find some cover to sling rocks from or whatever, he starts charging directly at Goliath. And he takes a stone out of his pouch, puts it in a sling, and starts to wind it up. And if you may have heard the story told as being a sling, as being a sling, you may have imagined like a slingshot where you got the fork stick and you pull back and you let go, and the elastic, whatever the elastic band is, shoots it forward. That's not the kind of sling that is being used or that is used in ancient Israel. It would be a length of leather strapping, probably about twice as long as the shooter's arm. And it would fold over in half, and in the middle there's a little flat piece of something, or there's something that can be used as a pouch to hold the stone. And so you put a stone in the middle of it and hold both ends in one hand and start to spin it to get it up to speed. And then you would let go with part of your hand and let go of one side of the strap, which would open up the sling and let the rock come flying out with all the momentum you've gotten by spinning it. And so it would actually get the rock up to a pretty decent speed, and it would be enough it could kill an unarmed person. They were used in some battles as kind of mostly to keep people, it wasn't very good for killing people. It was mostly used to kind of keep people's heads down so that they would be slower in approaching. It was to slow people down. But in this case, this is his weapon, and he winds it up and lets it go, and the stone sails across the gap, the space between David and Goliath, and it strikes Goliath in the forehead, right between his eyes. And whatever protection he was wearing was insufficient, and it sinks. The stone sinks into his forehead, and actually Goliath dies before he hits the ground. The head trauma is so severe that Goliath is dead before he hits the ground. But David, just to make double sure and as a very impressive show, runs up to where Goliath has just fallen and takes Goliath's own sword, the sword forged for this 9-foot tall man that's probably as tall as David is, or something close to it, and takes the sword and uses it to cut off Goliath's own head. And so then he takes Goliath's head and Goliath's sword and carries them back to Saul as trophies and proof that the deed is done. Well, the Philistines see that their giant warrior, the unstoppable machine Goliath, has been taken out by an Israelite kid, and now they're terrified. It's like, you gotta at least have it running through your head. It's like, if this is what the Israelite children can do, what are their warriors going to be like? And so the Philistine army breaks, and terror starts to flee. And Saul calls out the rest of the army, all those that are hiding in hills and those that are assembled, and they start to pursue the Philistines that are retreating and kill off a whole bunch of them. And so there's this great victory that Israel wins that day. And so the Israelites win, and David is the hero of the day. And of course, people saw him kill Goliath. The Israelites saw David kill Goliath. And so his popularity starts to shoot up really quickly. And people in Israel become very quickly David fans. And so Saul makes David a kind of a low commander, low officer in the army. He's still a young guy, not really old enough to be leading a whole bunch of men, but he makes him kind of a low officer in the army. But before long, he is he's leading men into battle, and they keep being successful, and so he keeps getting elevated until he's one of the top commanders in the army of Israel, in Saul's army. And he does so well, and people look up to him and love him so much that Saul starts to get paranoid about David's popularity, that David having won the people's hearts over, they might someday decide to get rid of Saul and make David king. And so this, especially, his paranoia gets really bad when he starts to hear women singing a song that says, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And so they start he hears a song that gives David credit for more victory in battle and more kills of the enemy than Saul. And so Saul becomes convinced that David is going to rise in popularity, and people are going to support David to be king, and David will either betray him or turn against him, or the people will kill Saul off and make David king in his place. And so at this point, David's popularity is really, really high. He's really popular. And so Saul doesn't think that he can directly act against David. And so he tries to orchestrate David's downfall. And his plan for how to do that is to offer David the opportunity to marry one of his daughters and become part of the king's family. And the way that he has to go about doing that, the thing that he has to do in order to marry Saul's daughter, is to acquire 100 Philistine foreskins. Foreskins, it's the excess skin at the end of a man's penis that is cut off during circumcision in Israel and still now. But that's what it is. And you're not going to get a foreskin from a Philistine while he's still kicking, right? And so basically this was a bounty for 100 Philistine warriors to be killed. The goal was to have David kill 100 Philistine warriors. And the thought, Saul's intention with this, was that David would go into battle against 100 Philistines, and he would be hopelessly outnumbered, and he'd be killed. And so he wanted basically to send David out against a very difficult, if not impossible, battle, against an impossible number of Philistines, and let David be killed in the process. Unfortunately for him, for Saul, it doesn't work out that way. First, he sends some servants to approach David about becoming the son-in-law of the king, and David isn't interested. He says, I'm a man from a relatively small, unimportant family. To become the son-in-law of the king, to become a member of the royal family, is not a small thing for a man like me. And so, no, that would be definitely beyond my station. And so in humility, David refuses to pursue marrying Saul's daughter. And so Saul ends up arranging a marriage for that daughter with somebody else. She gets married, and that's off the table. But a little later, another daughter of Saul has reached the age where she could get married, and Saul sends another group of servants to go back to David and kind of make the same offer. David has now had a little more time in the military. He's seen as a little bit more, his popularity has grown even more. And also, it turns out the daughter in question, Michal, really likes David, is actually really in love with him, and would love to be married to David. And so, when the servants this time come to David and say, the king would like you to become his son-in-law, he values you greatly, and his daughter Michal loves you and would like to be married to you. So would you become the king's son-in-law? Would you marry his daughter? And David again says, my family is not that important, not that big, and there's no way that we could afford the dowry. No way that my family could come up with the money, the dowry, to marry into the king's family. And so then the servants say, that's when they introduce the 100 Philistine foreskins thing. And they say the only thing that the king wants for the dowry for his daughter is 100 Philistine foreskins. And so David says, all right, I can do that. And so he takes a group of his most loyal followers, and they go out and they start bounty hunting. And they start acquiring 100 Philistine foreskins. They go into battle, they win, they kill, and they take their trophies, their proof, and they come back, and the day comes, they have enough, they come into the throne room, and David, the scene is kind of, it strikes me as humorous, that David has his men very carefully count out the 100 Philistine foreskins before the king to prove that they have met the bounty, And now David can marry Michal, marry the daughter. And so this plan ends up backfiring on Saul in a pretty big way. First of all, David does not die in the battle. In fact, he's able to kill 100 Philistines, and that is going to raise his popularity even more. And now he's married to the king's daughter, which makes him part of the royal family, which makes it even more likely that he would become king after Saul. And so there's still the son Jonathan that is more directly in line, but Saul has actually just strengthened David's claim to the throne because his plan backfired and failed. And as I said, mentioned or alluded to earlier, David and Jonathan they have become very, very dear friends, very close friends. And Jonathan actually gives David several gifts after the battle with Goliath, including his bow and quiver and his cloak. He gives him gifts that are recognizably his, because Jonathan was known as an archer, and he gives David his outer garment. And so he gives him these things that are recognizably Jonathan's, which would have made people look at David and think, son of the king. And so they would have started to associate David with the royal successor anyway. And so that's part of Saul's paranoia. But David and Jonathan are extremely close friends and love each other dearly. And eventually, after this failed plot, and David ends up marrying Michal, Saul's paranoia and fear of David doubles down, and it gets worse. And so he determines that he has to get rid of David. He has to get rid of him somehow, and so he determines that he's going to arrest David under the pretense of him having starting a rebellion against Saul and have him executed. Well, Jonathan hears about the plot, and so he warns David, and Michal, Saul's daughter, agrees to basically tell, when the king's men come the next day to arrest David, she will convince them that David is in bed sick, when in fact David is going to slip out overnight and go and hide somewhere secure. And so the next day, sure enough, comes along, and Michal convinces the temple guard or the palace guard that come and pound on the door to arrest David, convinces them that David is in bed sick. She's made this kind of mound in the covers, basically the pillow mound in the covers, to look like somebody's still in bed. And so she convinces them that he's too sick to get out of bed, and so they kind of wait and go back and report to the king what's been said, that David is sick and can't get out of bed. And so Saul sends back word and says, I don't care if he's sick, bring him here, and get him. And so they come back with the word, and they go in and they find, oh, wait, it's not David, it's a pile of pillows, or whatever it was. And so they come back and report that to the king, and all of this back and forth with word to the king and all that buys David a whole lot of extra time to be able to get away. And then Saul goes and confronts Michal, and Michal basically says, look, he's my husband, I had to be loyal to him. And so the king misses out on David, doesn't catch him. And so then Jonathan goes to talk to Saul and try to convince him that it's not right to be trying to kill David, to be getting rid of David. David's never been anything but loyal to him. This isn't right. And Saul becomes convinced that Jonathan, because he's pleading David's case, he becomes convinced that Jonathan is on David's side and is conspiring with David to kill him. And so he actually ends up throwing a spear at his own son. He misses, fortunately, but he throws a spear to kill his own son. Well, David has fled at this point, and so Saul goes to chase after him. And David stops, and he goes into a place where priests are gathered at the tabernacle, and he gets some help from the priests on the pretense of being on a mission for Saul. And they give him some of the leftover bread, the consecrated bread, and they give him Goliath's sword that had been kept there as kind of a trophy and a monument to God's power over the Philistines. And so they give him that, and David goes on and flees, and he takes this band of his most loyal men with him as he flees from Saul. And Saul finds out and tries to follow David, and he finds out that these priests have helped him, even though the priests were helping David on the pretense that David was on a mission for Saul. Saul is convinced that the priests have conspired now with David, and so he has all the priests that were involved killed. He has all the priests murdered. And then he goes on to pursue David. And eventually, after a whole bunch of running and changes around, David and his men are hiding out in this cave while Saul's men are pursuing them. And Saul doesn't realize that David and his men have hidden this close, that they're that close to them. And so he doesn't realize that they're in this cave. And so Saul's men, the army that he has chasing David, are outside, but Saul has to go relieve himself. He has to use the bathroom. And so he goes into the cave to relieve himself. And David realizes that right there is Saul. Saul doesn't have any clue that he's there. He's in an incredibly vulnerable position. This could be over just like that. All he's got to do is kill Saul. And some of his men are realizing that, kind of looking at him and like, in this. But David thinks that it would be wrong to kill or to harm the one that God has anointed to be king. And so Saul is still king, and it would be wrong for David to harm him. And so instead, David goes up and grabs the corner of Saul's cloak and cuts off a chunk of it with his sword. And then, just waits. And Saul leaves. And then David comes out of the cave and shouts after Saul, who's just gotten a little bit away and back to his men, shouts at him and says, "Hey, isn't this the corner of your cloak that I just cut off of you?" And so basically, if I wanted you dead, if I were really rebelling against you and trying to kill you, I just had the opportunity and I didn't take it. So I'm not trying to harm you. It would be evil, it would be wicked of me to harm the Lord's anointed one. And whether Saul genuinely believes this and is really repentant, or whether his whole army seeing David had the opportunity to kill him and didn't, means that Saul is afraid to go against David right now. One way or another, Saul tells David that, apologizes, says, "Surely, you are more righteous than I, and if you will promise not to harm me or my family, then I will not harm you." And so they swear the promise, and they go back, and David comes back and serves Saul for a little while until Saul gets to be paranoid once again, and David has to go on the run. And there's another moment where David has the opportunity to kill Saul and doesn't take it. He sneaks into the camp, is able to take a spear and a water jar from right next to Saul's bed in the middle of the night, sneaks back out of the camp, and then the next morning stands on the hill next to the camp and says, "Woohoo, look what I got. I could have killed you again and didn't." And so, Saul once again apologizes and says, it'll never happen again. But at that point, David realizes that he's not safe anywhere near Saul. And so he takes his band of most loyal men, and they actually go hide out in Philistine territory. And he finds a Philistine king that has heard about all of the trouble between David and Saul, that Saul has been trying to kill David as a rebel. And here is David now in Philistine territory. And so this Philistine king thinks, well, now I have this guy that is going to, has defected from Israel, and there's lots of ways that I can use this. And so he puts David and his men in this small town right next to his city, and David and his men are sent out, and they go out and raid, and the king thinks that they're going into Israel to raid, and raiding against the tribe of Judah and other lands, other Israelite territory. But instead, David and his men are actually going to various Philistine territories, Philistine towns that are more obscure and out there, and raiding those cities, killing everybody there so that nobody can report back, and then coming back and showing the spoils to the king and saying that he's been raiding in Israel. And so the king becomes convinced that there's nobody in Israel that's going to take David back. David has so burnt all his bridges in Israel that he can be trusted. And so he begins to trust David more and more. And eventually there comes a battle between the Philistines and Israel that David is going to join in with, but the other Philistine kings don't trust him and send him back. And Saul and his son Jonathan ended up dying in that battle. And that is the very end of 1 Samuel. And so we'll pick up with 2 Samuel and what the rest of David's story after the death of Saul and Jonathan on Friday. That's the very end of 1 Samuel. So we'll be starting in 2 Samuel chapter 1 next time.
So when's the last?